Friedrich Nietzsche is the man responsible for more tattoo ink and gym slogans than any philosopher in history. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. A line now scrawled across forearms, bumper stickers, and Instagram bios belonging to people who probably think Übermensch is a protein supplement. That quote, incidentally, is the philosophical equivalent of a tramp stamp. Once edgy, now embarrassingly overexposed. You see it and immediately suspect that nothing deep is going on underneath. He's remembered as the prophet of power, a thinker who urged humanity to rise above mediocrity, to transcend herd morality, to become something greater, something beyond good and evil. A man who championed discipline, clarity, and strength of will. And yet, the man himself was, well, not that. Nietzsche was a deeply sickly man, chronically ill, often bedridden, plagued by migraines that could blind him for days and stomach issues that made eating an existential threat. He resigned from his post as a professor in his 30s, not in some act of philosophical rebellion, but because he simply couldn't cope. From there, his life reads like the diary of someone losing a battle with his own nervous system, drifting across Europe, bouncing between rented rooms, living off a meager pension and the pity of friends. He had no real home, no enduring romantic relationship, and no career to speak of. A philosopher of strength, yes, but only on paper. This is the same man who wrote "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," extolling the virtues of self-overcoming and inner power while living a life that looked like a tragic endurance test. And then there's the infamous collapse. In 1889, Nietzsche reportedly saw a horse being beaten in the streets of Turin. He threw his arms around it in tears, collapsed to the ground, and never recovered. After that, he stopped writing. The man who once declared, "God is dead," spent the next decade babbling nonsense and signing letters, "The Crucified." He lived out his final years in total dependence, cared for by his mother, then his sister, while his mind dissolved into incoherence. This wasn't the triumphant final act of a man who had overcome the human condition. This was a collapse so total it made his earlier work look like the ravings of someone trying, and failing, to hold himself together. Nietzsche wanted to transcend humanity. He didn't even make it past himself. And that's not just irony, it's a gut punch. Because if this is the man behind all that talk of will to power, of embracing suffering, of becoming the author of your own values, then what are we really dealing with? A prophet? Or a patient? A visionary? Or a man shouting into the abyss in the hope that something would shout back? It's tempting to romanticize the fall, to say he flew too close to the sun, or that genius comes with a cost. But strip away the myth-making, and what you're left with is a man who collapsed under the weight of his own philosophy. If Nietzsche was the best-case scenario for his own ideas, then maybe the ideas weren't all that strong to begin with. Let's drop the mythology for a moment. Nietzsche wasn't just flawed, he was fundamentally incompatible with the very ideals he spent his life promoting. The man who preached power was powerless. The thinker who declared pity a weakness spent his final years as its full-time recipient, and the prophet of radical independence, entirely dependent on the charity of others. Let's start with his favorite target, weakness. Nietzsche detested it. Pity, empathy, compassion, these were symptoms of what he called slave morality. He reserved his admiration for strength, vitality, dominance, the traits of what he called the master class. He wrote as if life was a grand, unending competition between the strong and the weak. And the weak, they should stop pretending their values were noble. They were just bitter, envious, and trying to turn their failure into a virtue. So, naturally, you'd expect Nietzsche to be a specimen of dominance, some combination of Spartan discipline, Roman pride, and Stoic endurance. What you get instead is a socially awkward, half-blind academic, riddled with ailments, who collapsed in public and was spoon-fed by his sister for a decade. He talked about the will to power and lived with a body that struggled to process porridge. Even his writing reflects this contradiction. It's bursting with rage, not the cold fury of a strong man imposing order, but the spasmodic vitriol of someone screaming at the world from the margins. His sentences are brilliant, yes, but they're often frantic, twitching between confidence and desperation, like he's trying to convince himself as much as the reader. You don't read Nietzsche and feel grounded. You feel like someone just shouted poetry at you through a locked bathroom door. Then there's the way he handled relationships, which is to say, he didn't. Nietzsche never married. He proposed to the same woman, Lou Salome, multiple times. She rejected him repeatedly, often publicly, and eventually formed a platonic love triangle with Nietzsche and the philosopher Paul Ray, which Nietzsche promptly stormed out of. That's right, the man who spoke of emotional detachment was undone by unrequited love and intellectual jealousy. There's something almost comic about it. The apostle of self-overcoming, overcome by awkward romantic tension, the champion of Dionysian chaos, losing his mind over dinner invites and passive-aggressive letters. And when you look at the end of his productive life, before the collapse, it gets even more bizarre. His book, Ecce Homo, written just before his breakdown, reads like something between a manifesto and a meltdown. Chapter titles include Why I Am So Wise, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny. It's self-promotion turned hallucinatory. Imagine a philosopher trying to launch a self-help cult and having a psychotic break halfway through the mission statement. Of course, defenders say this is just brilliance misunderstood, that Nietzsche was ahead of his time, that his contradictions were deliberate. But at a certain point, that becomes a dodge. When every flaw becomes a feature, you're not defending a man, you're building a myth. Let's not ignore the dangerous side either. Nietzsche's ideas, stripped of nuance, have been used to justify everything from elitism to fascism to toxic masculinity. No, he wasn't a Nazi. His sister distorted much of his work after his death. But the fact that his writing lends itself so easily to abuse isn't just a matter of misreading, it's a flaw in the work itself. He wrote in aphorisms, thunderclaps of vague genius, without the guardrails of clarity or humility. He left just enough ambiguity for others to weaponize him. That's not just unfortunate, that's irresponsible. Because when you write like Nietzsche, when you refuse to clarify, when you trade system for style, when you disguise incoherence as profundity, you don't just invite misinterpretation, you practically franchise it. He became the philosopher of the misunderstood, the angry, the self-important, the patron saint of loners who think they're prophets. And that may say more about the world than it does about Nietzsche, but he handed them the tools. So what are we left with? A man who detested weakness, but lived in it, who glorified the individual but lost every relationship, who declared himself a god and then fell silent for a decade. The case against Nietzsche is simple. He couldn't live what he wrote. And that matters, because philosophy isn't just wordplay, it's supposed to be a way of life. And if your life is the exact opposite of your philosophy, then either the philosophy doesn't work, or it was never meant to be lived at all. Let's talk about what Nietzsche actually taught. Strip away the memes, the bastardized sound bites, the Jim Bro misquotations. What's left is still wild, fractured, and furious. Nietzsche didn't write philosophy so much as he waged war with it. He wasn't interested in building systems or carefully argued treatises. He was a fire starter. His books read like manifestos delivered from the edge of a breakdown, and often that's exactly what they were. Take his obsession with the will to power. It's the idea that life isn't about morality or truth, but about force, about growth, dominance, overcoming, It's not a moral code. It's a psychological drive. Everything living wants to expand, to rise, to assert itself. And those who repress that drive in the name of humility or charity, Nietzsche saw them as frauds. Weaklings dressing their fear up as virtue. Then there's the eternal recurrence. It's his cheerful little thought experiment. What if you had to live your life over and over, in every detail, forever? No edits, no upgrades. Would you say yes to that, or collapse at the thought? For Nietzsche, your answer revealed whether you were affirming life or secretly hoping for escape. Spoiler, most people are hoping for escape. And at the center of it all is the Übermensch, the overman, the one who doesn't need God or rules or herd approval. He writes his own values, lives beyond good and evil, and treats suffering as fuel. It's not a person necessarily. It's more of an ideal, a goal, a sketch of who we could become if we stopped clinging to guilt, fear, and conformity. So far, so inspiring. Until you remember who's saying this, Nietzsche wasn't exactly cutting through the noise from a position of serenity. He was bitter, isolated, and increasingly unstable. Thus spoke Zarathustra. The book in which he lays out most of this reads like scripture on amphetamines. There are wise moments, yes, but there's also a man shouting into the void and hoping it echoes back in capital letters. This isn't reasoned philosophy, it's stylized frustration. It's the literary equivalent of a man standing on a cliff, screaming, "Be stronger," at a world that's already trying not to drown. And that's part of the problem. His ideas weren't grounded in lived practice. Nietzsche didn't become the Übermensch. He imagined him. He projected what he wished he could be, then judged everyone else for not being that fantasy. There's a reason his work resonates so strongly with disillusioned, alienated men. It wasn't written from above. It was written from the bottom, looking up with rage. This doesn't make the ideas worthless, but it does mean we need to be careful about how we read them. When someone who is failing by every societal measure starts preaching the virtues of transcending society, you have to wonder, is this wisdom or just coping? Because the line between vision and delusion isn't always bright. Nietzsche wasn't laying down commandments. He was broadcasting an emotional state in philosophical form. Zarathustra isn't a guidebook. It's a fever dream, a philosophical howl from someone who desperately wanted the world to make sense and couldn't quite force it to. And then there's the tone. Nietzsche writes like someone who's furious that reality won't behave. He calls compassion weakness. He mocks morality. He tears down belief systems like a vandal with a hammer, but rarely tells you what to build in their place. This isn't construction. It's demolition. It's beautiful, angry, and often directionless. Yes, he had insight. But insight without humility is just arrogance in disguise. And Nietzsche, for all his brilliance, rarely doubted himself. He questioned everything, except the one thing he probably should have: his own stability. So, what did Nietzsche teach? Strength, will, transcendence, but also alienation, bitterness, and unreality. His philosophy is not a roadmap. It is a red flag, waving violently from a man on fire. So here's the twist. What if Nietzsche's collapse wasn't a failure of his philosophy, but a direct result of its accuracy? What if he didn't go mad because he was wrong, but because he was too right, too early, and far too alone? It's easy to mock him. The man who rejected God ends up signing letters as the crucified. The man who champions strength ends up broken. But there's another way to look at it. Maybe Nietzsche wasn't trying to be the Übermensch. Maybe he was just trying to survive the realization that no one else was. He saw things most people spend their entire lives avoiding: the death of meaning, the decay of morality, the hollowness of social convention. He stared into that abyss for decades. And the abyss, predictably, stared back. And it didn't blink. Because let's be honest, Nietzsche saw the collapse of the old world coming long before the rest of us caught on. He predicted the existential dread of the 20th century, the disillusionment after world wars, the rise of nihilism, the burnout of modernity. He knew that when you pull the rug out from under religion and tradition, you don't get freedom, you get vertigo. You get people searching for meaning in ideology, in consumption, in power, and they lose themselves anyway. That wasn't a mistake in his thinking. That was the point. And in that light, Nietzsche's madness becomes something else. It's not the collapse of a weak man. It's the burnout of someone who went too deep into the engine room of human thought and came back speaking in flames. This is where philosophers like Foucault, Camus, and Jung took him seriously. They saw in Nietzsche a kind of philosophical martyr, not someone to imitate, but someone to understand. A warning wrapped in brilliance. Foucault said Nietzsche gave us the tools to analyze power without pretending we were above it. Camus saw him as the forefather of rebellion against absurdity. Jung, quite literally, thought Nietzsche's madness was the natural result of confronting the unconscious without protection. They didn't laugh at him. They learned from him. Even the way he wrote fragmented, aphoristic poetic starts to make sense in this context. He wasn't building arguments. He was leaving trail markers, trying to map a collapse in real time. If Descartes was a builder of systems, Nietzsche was an archaeologist of ruins still on fire. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. A lot of what Nietzsche said turned out to be right. Religion hasn't recovered. Politics has become theater. Most people now live in a permanent state of low-level dread, medicated, numbed, or distracted. We pretend we're free, but we're terrified of freedom. We have more options than ever, and less purpose than ever. Nietzsche saw it coming, and he didn't soften the blow. So yes, he collapsed. But maybe that collapse was the cost of seeing too clearly, feeling too deeply, and having absolutely no one around him who could help carry the weight. It's tempting to dismiss Nietzsche as a madman. That way we don't have to confront the possibility that his madness was a reasonable response to an unbearable truth. Because if he wasn't insane, then the rest of us might be living in denial. And that's harder to stomach. So, here we are. Nietzsche, the philosopher who hated systems, became one. The man who rejected dogma was turned into dogma. And the thinker who begged people to question everything has become the poster child for people who question nothing, especially themselves. It's ironic. Nietzsche was obsessed with the idea that most people sleepwalk through life, parroting ideas they barely understand. Yet today, his name gets slapped onto self-help quotes, protein tubs, and social media bios by people who've never read more than a paragraph. The man who wanted to destroy empty slogans has become one. That's not entirely his fault. The world is good at turning complex people into mascots. Marx gets blamed for totalitarian regimes. Freud gets reduced to jokes about mothers. Nietzsche gets tagged onto memes about being a lion, because reading the genealogy of morals takes more effort than an Instagram quote. But here's the thing. Nietzsche never claimed to be a guru. He didn't offer peace or happiness or even clarity. He offered confrontation. He wanted to shake people out of their moral sleep, to make them feel the weight of existence without the training wheels of religion or tradition. He was trying to speak to a future generation, us, and maybe that's why his work still hits a nerve, because we are the future he feared. The culture of shallow meaning, the politics of performance, the endless search for stimulation. He saw it all coming. He just didn't have the social media account to go viral for it. So what do we do with him? He wasn't a good role model. He wasn't kind. He wasn't happy. He wasn't even particularly coherent most of the time. But he was right about a lot of things. Especially the hard things, the uncomfortable things, the things we still don't want to face. Like how meaning isn't given to us, we have to make it. Or how most of our values are inherited, not chosen. Or how power seeps into everything, especially the things we claim are moral. These aren't easy truths, but they're real. And maybe that's the point. You don't have to like Nietzsche, but you probably should take him seriously, because ignoring him doesn't make his insights less accurate. It just makes us less willing to admit how fragile our worldview actually is. In the end, Nietzsche wasn't wise in the way we like our wise people to be. He wasn't peaceful. He wasn't balanced. He didn't have it all figured out. But he did have something else. Honesty. Brutal, relentless honesty. The kind that doesn't flinch, even when it probably should. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's not. Maybe Nietzsche is exactly what happens when you see the truth too clearly and have no idea what to do with it.